Let's turn to John chapter 18. In John's gospel, we have a lot of different things, a lot of different details that are mentioned that you don't have in the synoptic gospels, and there's some reasons for this. First off, we know that John wasn't trying to tell a chronological history of Jesus' life. But we also know that John had his own reason for writing. It wasn't to tell the whole story that the synoptics had already done. There was already 3 gospels that did that. He wanted to bring out, of course, the divinity of Jesus. He wanted to bring out his messiahship. Not that the others didn't, but he really focused on that. And he's a lot more theological and a lot more interested in the sayings of Jesus than he is necessarily the stories. I mean, he adds the stories just to give us proofs and give us understanding of what's going on, and also to show us that the things he was saying were true. But at the same time, he focuses more on, we know, like he says in chapter 20, that you might believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And so when we read through chapter 18, I'm going to point out some different places where it's not mentioned in the other synoptic gospels, or there has been a lot of times people who have come along and said, well, if you compare John and you compare the synoptic gospels, they don't match up, and therefore they want to dispute or discredit the gospels altogether because they can't make them reconcile with each other. But we'll also give some answers and some reasons for why there are the discrepancies, or seemed discrepancies, I should say. And they're perfectly plausible explanations and reasons for why there seems to be a little bit of a difference between John and the synoptic gospels. We know, first off, John was written a lot later than the synoptic gospels. So he includes, like Peter, for instance, we're going to read about Peter. He includes Peter's name, and the reason why he didn't want to include it in the beginning, or at least I should say the synoptics didn't want to include it, was because Peter was still alive, and also because he could have been held accountable for his actions by cutting off the high priest's ear, or not the high priest's ear, but the high priest's guard's ear. And so there's just different reasons for different things. But anyways, I'm going to read all the way through chapter 18, and then we'll go back and we'll just kind of look at some different verses in detail. It says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, and where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. And Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to them, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, who are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered them, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. And the servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas' first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. And then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servant and the officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine, and Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" And Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Then when they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. And Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and they said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Then said Pilate to them, "You take him and judge according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to them, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die." And then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I would not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." And Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you then a king?" And Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" Then they all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So, we have this story, right? And you could break this chapter down into a few sections. You can break it down into them being in the garden and arresting Jesus. And then you have this kind of narrative that's interwoven with Jesus' trial before Annas and Peter's denying Jesus. And then he's brought before Caiaphas, but it's actually not mentioned in John's Gospel what Caiaphas said, what occurred before Caiaphas. We have that actually in the other synoptics. And then you have him being brought before Pilate and the Inquisition and the asking of the questions that Pilate asks him. So, in the first section, you notice that we have here, it talks about how Jesus is going into this garden, right? He crosses over the brook Kidron. Now, if you go up to Jerusalem today, they still will point out to you where the valley of Kidron is. And you can usually go right across through the valley. There's no water there. But in the days of Jesus, in the past, in the winter time and in the fall and in the early spring, there was usually water that was running through this valley. And the reason being was there were some springs, but also there was a lot of water that was being used up on the Temple Mount. And what they were doing was they were cleansing the temple, cleansing the precinct area from all the sacrifices and the blood. And you have to remember, during the Passover, they were sacrificing at least hundreds of thousands of sheep in one day. And so this was a pretty bloody ordeal, and you can imagine how much blood was probably down running through the Kidron at this time. So they cross over this stream or this brook, and it says that they go into a garden here. We're told in the other Gospels that they went into the Garden of Gethsemane. And so it's a place where Jesus would go to retreat, to get away, and you could still go there today. They have a place marked out where it's most likely, more than likely, the Garden of Gethsemane was. And so they go down here, and we see that Judas is coming. Now, John doesn't mention a lot of the things that the other Gospels mention about him going in and praying in the garden and coming before the Father and asking him, if this cup can pass from me, then please let it, but not my will, but your will be done. And the other disciples, of course, falling asleep. So John isn't mentioning these things, but he is mentioning here this kind of scenario that takes place when they come to arrest Jesus. And the first thing is they ask, well, Jesus comes forward and says, well, you know, who are you guys looking for? I mean, Jesus actually knew who they were looking for. He had been saying, let's go because my time has come, my hour has come. It even says here in John's commentary that he knew all things that were coming down, everything that was going to happen. And so when he steps forward and he says, you know, who are you looking for? He's not doing it in a really inquisitive because he didn't know who they were looking for. He's doing it in more of a manner to protect his disciples because he knows that they're going to also want to arrest those who are following him. And so when he steps forward and he kind of takes control of the situation and says, who are you looking for? It says that everybody fell back when they asked him, well, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, well, I am he. And so it says that they fall down. Now, John is writing this, remember, because he's wanting to point out the power and he's wanting to point out the fact that if Jesus did not want to be arrested, if Jesus did not want to be taken to and before the high priest and be taken before Pilate and be put on the cross at this time, he didn't have to. He had all the power at his disposal to stop it. But the fact of the matter is that he was willingly going, he was willingly being obedient to the Father. And so John is wanting us to recognize this and realize this, that it's not about a set of circumstances that all of a sudden befell Jesus, that caught them and him and his disciples unaware, and he was taken and you know, this horrible thing was done and he was put on the cross. No, this was a set out plan. This was something that God had ordained from the beginning, and this was something that only at the specific time and only at the specific moment that God and that Jesus wanted it to happen, it happened. It's kind of like for us too, you know. A lot of times I think we're really worried about, well, if I make a wrong step here, if I go over there and I'm not supposed to go that way, like, you know, maybe something's bad's going to happen to me that's not intended. And we kind of can have this, a little bit of a paranoia, I guess you can call it, about like, oh, I can't make a mistake. And if we're seeking and following God, we shouldn't. I don't believe we should be restless. I don't think we should be unpeaceful in that way, because God has an appointed time for us to die. And if we are following him and we're seeking to follow his footsteps, and we, you know, accidentally walk into the wrong building, or we accidentally walk into the wrong city one day, I believe that God is going to protect us until that time and that hour that he has prepared for us to go. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't just say, well, I'm not going to listen to God and I'm going to go sin and do a bunch of horrible things, and that is going to keep me from any sort of problems or any sort of thing that might bring death. But if I'm seeking to follow God, and if I'm really truly just living my life according to his plan, as far as I know what he's saying, we shouldn't be worried, we shouldn't be anxious, we shouldn't have these anxieties about whether I'm going to make a mistake or I'm going to go somewhere, or God's, you know, something's going to happen to me if I don't know if I'm really supposed to go here today. And so I think this is a good lesson for us as well. So Jesus, you know, he says, I am he, and they fall down. And then again, he asks them who they were seeking. And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. And basically asked them to let his disciples go also. And then it says that Peter takes out his sword and lops off this guard's ear. And John names him Malchus. None of the other Gospels actually name him by name. But all of the Gospels actually tell us this story. Now, John doesn't tell us that Jesus stooped down, picked up the ear, and put it back on and basically miraculously healed Malchus. But he does say that Jesus tells Peter to put away his sword in his sheath. For shall I not drink of the cup that the Father has given to me? So really what he's saying to Peter is, listen, this is all foreordained. This is God's will. We shouldn't be fighting against it. We shouldn't be seeking to stop it. Unfortunately, Peter a lot of times found himself going against the will of God. If you remember when he said, "No, Lord, let it not be so," to Jesus when he was talking about his crucifixion, and Peter said, "Get behind me, Satan, because you don't know what spirit you're of." And so we have to remember that if something is God's will, we don't want to be found ourselves fighting against it. And so that's why it's important to first off know what God is doing, and to really I believe that we should put ourselves in God's hands. It's not in if God wants to save us, if God wants to bring us through, he's going to bring deliverance. He may prompt us to do something, I don't know, but we shouldn't take matters into our own hands or action into our own hands and just say, you know what, I'm just going to defend myself, I'm going to take care of this situation in a physical, worldly way. But we should really be praying, and we should be seeking for the Father's deliverance and the Father's salvation. If you read through the Psalms, that's what David talks about many times, And if you read even when David is being pursued by Saul, David will never lift his hand against Saul. The few times that he does anything to Saul, he actually regrets what he's done. If you remember when he goes and he cuts off a piece of garment, he feels horrible for it afterwards, even though he really could have had the opportunity to kill Saul right there. But David realized that God was the one that was going to protect him. God was the one that was going to save him from Saul. And it wasn't going to be done by David's hands, but it was going to be done by God's, using different circumstances and different things and happening. So the other Gospels also tell us that Peter, or when Peter does this, that Jesus said to Peter, put away your swords, for those who live by the sword die by the sword. This is a very famous quote of Jesus, right? That if you're going to take up the sword, if you're going to seek to win your freedom, win your whatever, your rights or things like that by the sword, then you're going to also die by the sword. This is what's going to come upon you. And unfortunately, many times religions and even Christianity in the past has not taken these words of Jesus, but they have taken up the sword. They have done things to defend themselves that I believe they weren't called to do. They were not called to come against these different peoples and different things. So that's the story of Jesus' betrayal in the garden. And then you have the next section that speaks about coming before the high priest. Now there's something here. It doesn't mention in any of the Gospels that Jesus was brought before Annas. They just say that they took him before Caiaphas. Now we know that Annas and Caiaphas, Luke tells us in chapter 3, verse 2 of Luke, that Annas and Caiaphas both had been high priests. During these time periods, the high priest's place, this high priest position, was a position that was basically being bought and sold, and it was very political. We know that the Romans were setting up high priests. We know that the Jews were disagreeing with the high priest. They were setting up their own high priests. We know that there was just a lot of, kind of like today's politics, a lot of grappling, a lot of dissension over who was going to be high priest. And so Annas and Caiaphas, both being high priests, but we know Annas is actually the elder. He's the oldest. And so it's probably the reason they bring him to Annas first, even though at this time Annas isn't the high priest, was because they wanted to seek Annas' counsel, and they wanted to give him the first, what would you call it, I guess just the first chance to talk to him and to question him and to say what he thought should be done with him. So they bring him before Annas, and Annas was actually the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And then we have this story of Peter, right? Jesus had foretold that Peter was going to deny him 3 times. And of course we know Peter said, no way, it's not going to happen. I'll even go to death with you. But look at what Peter is doing as he's following Jesus. Because we could say, well, yeah, if you look at the other Gospels, it says all of the disciples forsook him in the garden. They all ran off. Even one of them, so much so that he ran off without his clothes, right? So Peter, at least you still see his love, you still see his devotion to Jesus, but yet he's walking in a state of fear, and he's walking in a state of not really wanting them to know who he is. So he's just kind of lurking in the background following Jesus. He's not there with Jesus. He's not making himself known. And this is really, I think, why he gets into trouble in the first place, because his faith, we know, was weak. His faith was not as strong as it was later on. But also, Peter, by kind of just hiding out and just trying to pretend like he didn't know Jesus, he's basically denying him already. He didn't even have to say the words, right? And I feel like this can be for us a lot of times too. I know for myself, there's times where I have been in certain situations where I didn't want people to know that I was a Christian. And this has been more in the past. But I remember there would be times where I didn't want people to know I was a Christian because of what was going on. And I just didn't want to, you know, maybe cause people to think I was different or weird, or because there was times where it might have been even a little bit dangerous to me, or I felt like people might not like me if they knew I was a Christian. And so I wouldn't tell people that I was a Christian. And I would kind of try to, in a way, hide it. I mean, I wouldn't outright say, no, I'm not a Christian, but I wouldn't be a vocal, it wouldn't be something that was apparent and obvious. And this is basically what Peter is doing. And in this, he's setting himself up for the fall. And the same way for us, if we do that, we're setting ourselves up for a fall. We're already denying him because it's already in our heart, right? It doesn't have to be in our actual actions even. It doesn't have to be in our words to people. It can just be in the fact that, hey, you know, I don't want these people to know I'm a Christian because then they might not like me. I don't want people to know I'm a Christian at work because then they might give me a hard time or I might get fired. All of these different, you know, ways that we try to like hide what we are, I don't believe are biblical, and I don't believe we should be doing. And we need to ask the Lord to just strengthen our faith that, hey, you know what, if I lose my job, if I lose my friends, if I get ridiculed, if I get beat up, even whatever it might be that happens to me, then I'm going to accept that, because I'm going to accept that the Lord is the one that's protecting and watching over me. And so I shouldn't be ashamed and I shouldn't be afraid of him and of being named with the name of Christ. And so that's what Peter is doing, though. He's just kind of hiding. He's out in the background. And so it talks about here how this other disciple was there that knew the high priest. Many people believe this is John. We know John never mentions his name specifically in the gospel, but he talks about himself as the disciple who Jesus loved. And it's a very good possibility here that when he names this disciple, he's also the disciple, but it's not for certain, of course. And so then in verse 19, you kind of have this questioning of Jesus, right? And the high priest says to Jesus, so, you know, tell me about your disciples and your doctrine, basically. What have you been teaching? And Jesus knows what's going on here, we know, and he has a lot of wisdom in his answers to them. Because basically what he's doing is he is exposing the falsehood of this whole procession. Because under the law, if they're to bring him in and to charge him with crimes, then they need to bring witnesses, right? They don't bring him before them and start to question him. They need to bring people who are certified witnesses, and they need two of them, at least 2 or 3, to come before and to say, this is, you know, what this man did, or this is what this man said. Now, we're told in the other Gospels that they actually started bringing these false witnesses before, but the problem was none of the false witnesses' testimonies would agree. One guy would get up and say one thing, and the other guy would get up and say the other thing. And then finally there was 2 false witnesses who came, and they said, basically he had taught that if they would destroy this temple, he was going to raise it up in 3 days. Basically, he was saying, I'm going to destroy this temple. That's what they claimed he said, where he had said, if you destroyed this temple. And so they kind of twisted his words a bit. But Jesus is making them abide by the rules, basically, of the law here. He's saying to them, you know what? You guys know what I taught. You guys know what I preached in the synagogues, because there was religious Jews there every week when I was there preaching, and so have them come, have them testify. Why should I testify? Why should I speak about my own doctrine, basically perjure myself? And so he's struck, of course, against, you know, by one of the guards there, one of the officers, and he says, how dare you answer the high priest that way. Now, Jesus' answers back to him is also according to the law, because he's saying, listen, if I'm speaking evil, if I'm doing something evil, then testify of it. But you know you have no right to strike me. Under the canons of the Sanhedrin and the canons of the laws that the Jewish authorities were under, you were not allowed to strike a witness. You're not allowed to touch a witness until they were convicted of a crime. And so what this officer does is basically a crime against him, and he should have been fined, actually, according to the canons of the Sanhedrin. And so he does this, and so that's why Jesus answers him back that way. And then you have, of course, Simon Peter again denying 3 more times. He continues to, kind of stay outside, and there's people questioning him, and people are saying to him, well, why, didn't I see you in the garden? One of the relatives of the man who had his ear cut off, Malchus, sees him and says, I think I saw you in the garden. And of course, Peter continues to deny. And then finally it says, on the 3rd denial, as soon as he did it, he hears the cock or the rooster crow. There's an interesting little side note here. In the Greek, I don't know what the word is exactly, but it was a word that was used for when they would make the changing of the guards. It's not an actual rooster that was crowing. It was basically the changing of the Roman guard would happen at certain times throughout the night on their night watches, and they would call it the cock crow at a certain time when they did this change. And so it's more than likely it wasn't really like a rooster, but it was the changing of the guard, the signal or the trumpet or whatever it was to tell everyone, okay guys, it's time to switch guarding. It's time for people to take leave of their guarding and other people to come in. And so Peter, we know.
Excuse me, it's also the rooster.
It could be the rooster, yeah. It can be. But it also can be, it was used to speak of the changing of the guard as well. So I guess it could have been the rooster, but most people think it's actually the changing of the guard.
No, in Greek it says the rooster.
Rooster.
Because Jesus told him, before the rooster will 3 times, you will deny me.
Yeah.
And this happened.
Yeah. So you have here again Peter failing, right? And I can relate to Peter because I know many times I have failed, and we're going to come to a place later on in John chapter 21 where Jesus restores Peter, and Jesus never had a grudge. He wasn't angry with Peter. But he wanted Peter to learn his lesson, basically. And the same thing goes for us. I mean, I know there's been many times where I said, okay, I'm not ever going to do a certain thing again, right? And yet, I do it again. I end up falling again. And God doesn't hold grudges against us. God doesn't tell us, well, I don't love you anymore, or you're not my child anymore, or I'm angry at you, or things like that. But what he does do is he wants us to learn from our mistakes. And that's why when Jesus comes to Peter and he talks to him, he begins to question him. He says, what do you love more than me, basically? Or do you love these things more than me? And a lot of times it's the same thing for us. Like, it comes down to, it boils down to, who do you love more than me? Because if I love the things of this world, and I love the things of my flesh more than I love the things of God, then I will always stumble and I always fall into those things again. Once I've come to a place where I put the things of God first, and that's really truly what I'm seeking wholeheartedly, that's when I'm going to find, like Peter, the victory and be able to walk that walk that we've been called to walk, Lord. But until that point, we're going to say, oh no, I'm strong enough. We're going to have our own self-reliance. We're going to think, yes, I can do it myself. And we're not going to be praying. We're not going to be listening and heeding the warnings of God, the Holy Spirit, when he warns us, no, you shouldn't go over here, no, you shouldn't partake in this, because it only leads to something else. And so we have to be willing to be humble enough to say, you know what, I'm not strong enough, and I need to heed those warnings, and I need to heed those, those rebukes when God rebukes me. And I need to pay attention and be in prayer for strengthening, and to make sure that I'm not going somewhere or doing something that's going to lead me down that path. And so that's what Peter had to learn through this. This is really, I think, the ultimate learning experience for Peter here. And it doesn't mean that he never sinned again, of course, but it does mean that Peter, after this, was so humbled that he began to rely on the Holy Spirit rather than on his own, kind of strength, his own. Because Peter, even though he failed, he seems to be probably one of the strongest of all the disciples in his will and in his love and in his devotion to the Lord. He had great love, he had great devotion, but the problem was he didn't have the humility at this point. And he's learning humility through this. And so a lot of times, when we fall and we do things, we're learning humility. That's what we have to be taught. Nothing more a lot of times than you can't do it, or nothing more than you are a sinner and your flesh still remains with you, and if you seek to walk after the flesh, you're going to be sinning, you're going to be doing things you shouldn't. And so then you have in verse 28, Jesus being taken to Pilate's court, and it's called the Praetorium there. Now this was a place where we know that's called the Antonia Fortress that Herod the Great had built up as one of his palaces, and the Roman proconsul began to basically live and reside in the Praetorium. And this was actually located just north of the Temple Mount. If you go to Jerusalem today and you walk down the Via Dolorosa Road from Stephen's Gate or the Lion's Gate, you can still see a lot of the places along this road where they are marked out as parts of the Praetorium, parts of this palace. And they actually have an underneath area where they have found places where the soldiers used to play games and different things for the prisoners' garments. And so all of those things that are described in what took place in Jesus' crucifixion, there's proofs there actually that these things were taking place in this area. So this Antonia Fortress is basically the place of judgment. And so they bring him in, and it says that the religious Jews, they did not want to go into this place because they didn't want to be defiled. And we know that they didn't want to go in because Gentiles, they didn't want to be defiled amongst, being around in the house of a Gentile. That was something that was forbidden for the religious Jews, but also because it was Passover, there's probably leaven still inside, right? Hasn't been cleansed, hasn't been purified. And so they also don't want to go inside to the private residences because they don't want to become ritually unclean according to the law. Now, there's been some dispute about this whole thing here where it says so that they could eat the Passover, because we know that Jesus and his disciples the night before had already eaten the Passover. So why are they talking about eating the Passover now? And some people have tried to say, see, John is trying to say that the Passover hadn't yet come, and the synoptics are saying it had come, and there's this discrepancy. But the thing is this word Passover here is used throughout John to describe that the Passover, the whole 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's not used to describe a specific Passover night Seder that we know and think of that Jesus and his disciples had that night. And so when it's saying that they didn't want to be able to be defiled, that they could eat the Passover, there was many sacrifices that took place on this day as well. Not just the Passover lamb was sacrificed, but bulls, goats, things like that were sacrificed the next day, and the priests, of course, had to partake of these things. The priests had to eat of these things according to the law. And so to say that John is saying that the Passover hadn't yet happened here is really, it's not what he's trying to say. And so, anyways, you have Pilate begins to question them. Or first off, they bring him, and notice what's going on. Because Pilate, he doesn't want anything to do with Jesus, right? He doesn't want any trouble with the whole, this whole Jewish question of the law. And so he's saying, what's the matter? Why are you guys bringing this guy before me? And they're saying, well, if we hadn't had, if you hadn't done evil, we wouldn't have brought him before you. And he says, go ahead and just judge him according to your guys' own law. Why do you have to bring him before me? And you see the reason that the religious Jews, the priests, were doing this is because, first off, they wanted to put Jesus to death, right? They didn't want to not be able to put Jesus to death. And according to them, they're not allowed to put Jesus to death. They don't have that power. It was taken away from them really by the Roman government. But the second thing is, we know that they still put people to death, even though they didn't do it so much. They still did do it in this day. We even know Stephen was put to death. We know Paul put some people to death. So what was hindering them from putting Jesus to death? I believe it was, the reason was because first off, they knew that the people loved Jesus, and so they didn't want to be looked at by the people as being the ones that had killed Jesus. They wanted the Romans to do it so that they could just blame the Romans for doing it. And then secondly, they wanted him to be crucified. We know that if they had been the ones putting him to death, it would have been by stoning. But we know crucifixion was a horrible type of death. And so I believe that that is another reason, was they wanted to see him crucified because it was such a horrible thing. And they had so much anger and so much hatred towards him that this was basically bringing this forth, this desire to see him tortured as much as possible. So you have these questions going on, and Pilate saying, well, you should do this. So then he takes him back in. And in verse 36, in verse 33, Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus asks him, well, are you saying this for yourself because you believe it, or has other people told you? You know, I mean, why are you even asking me this question? Am I the king of the Jews? And then he asks him again, basically, and he says to him, my kingdom's not of this world. You know, so what he's basically saying is, yes, I am a king, but it's not in the way that you think, because Jesus realizes that if he proclaims himself as a king, a literal, physical, earthly king, that he's basically going against Rome, and he's basically going against Caesar's authority and Caesar's power, and that would be a punishable offense by death. And so when Jesus is very careful to answer him, he tells him, my kingdom is not of this world. I'm not in any way in opposition to Caesar. I'm not in any way here to take Caesar's position or to fight against Caesar for a kingdom. I'm not claiming those powers or those authorities, but I am claiming that I am a king, but in a heavenly sense, in a heavenly nature. And then he tells Pilate that, you know, if I wanted, my servants could come and, you know, they could fight against you, and they could fight against the Jewish people and deliver me. There's no problem. But now my kingdom is not from here, so it's not about this earthly kingdom. So even though he's denying having this earthly kingdom, he's still wanting Pilate to know that he has power, he has authority to do whatever he wants. But because he has chosen to not make his kingdom of this earth, there's no danger, there's no threat to the Roman Empire, there's no threat to anybody. And so Pilate again says to him in verse 37, Jesus again says to him, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And then Pilate says, what is the truth? So basically Pilate is kind of, you know, he seems to be somebody who has lost all belief in an absolute truth. He's just kind of a skeptic, and probably just this whole procession of what's going on between the Jews coming against Jesus and then Jesus' answers is causing Pilate to really kind of grapple like what's going on. We know from the other Gospels that Pilate's wife had a dream the night before, and she had come to Pilate and said, whatever happens, do not put this good, this just man to death. Do not condemn him, because he's a good and just man. She had this dream, she told him. But unfortunately, Pilate didn't listen to his wife, right? And he went along with the whole plan that they had. And so, in verse 39, he comes and he brings Jesus back out, and he tells them, basically, I find no fault with him. There's nothing under Roman law that I can punish him with. And so he says, we have a custom, and so I need to release somebody to you guys. Who should I release to you? And of course, we know that they say, we don't want Jesus of Nazareth released. We want Barabbas. And Barabbas, we know, was a murderer. He was a dissident. He was somebody who had caused a lot of problems. And so, instead of taking Jesus, the innocent man, they take a murderer, they take somebody who was a very evil man in his place. And next week we're going to go into a little further, just, Pilate's decision. There's a few more questions, a few more things happen, but we'll close with that because it's a lot. And I just think that as we read through this, and just as we are in the Passover week, we should just always think on these things and remember these things that were taking place this week, a little less than 2,000 years ago. And just how everything that's happening was going according to God's plan. There was nothing that was out of God's plan. It wasn't like, sometimes we look around us and we see all this crazy stuff going on in the world. We see these earthquakes, and maybe in our own personal lives, there's problems, maybe financial problems, maybe physical problems, maybe, problems in our families, there's problems amongst our friends, there's problems sometimes even, amongst us with believers in the church. And we tend to get our eyes focused on the problems, like what's happening. And when we do that, when we start looking at problems, when we start looking at things that are happening and things that are going on around us, we always lose sight of who God is, and we begin to get scared, and we begin to worry, and we begin to try to figure things out, and we begin to question God. God, why is this happening? Why? We're afraid, we're fearful, we think God's not there anymore, we think that God has maybe forsaken us or left us, whatever it is. But if you look at what's going on here, you come to understand something, and that is that it doesn't matter what's happening around you, it doesn't matter, it's all according to God's plan. He's allowing it for a purpose. If he didn't want it happening, he could stop it, but he's allowing it for a purpose. And we don't need to get worried or worked up about what's happening around us. We just need to continue to be faithful and to trust him, to seek him. And when you trust and when you seek the Lord in that way, in those times of turmoil, you're going to have peace like you'll never know in any other time. People will look at you and they'll say to you, how do you have so much peace? They're going to say, if I was in your position, I would be pulling my hair out. If I was in your position, I would be freaking out, whatever. How can you have peace? And this is what God wants us to have. But I don't think we can have it if we start to focus on why and everything that's going on around us and getting our eyes on those things and starting to say, well, I need to come against this, or I need to stop this, or I need to, we don't really, we just need to trust in God. And when he moves us, when he guides us, he'll tell you if you need to go speak to someone. He'll tell you if you need to go do a certain thing. But before that, you shouldn't be up running around trying to do stuff, right? Until you've heard specific words from God to the contrary that this is what he wants you to do, and this is the way he wants you to act. And I found a lot of times in my life that just when I pray and I just ask the Lord, okay, Lord, I don't know what the situation is, I don't know what you're doing right now or how it's going to get worked out, but I'm just praying you would work it out. He works it out, and I don't even have to do anything. I could tell you probably 90% of the time that happens. There's 10% of the time where he directs me to do something. And so we have to keep that in mind too when we're in these storms, like Jesus is in the storm, that it's the Father's will. The Father is in control, and we just need to look to him. And as we look to him, he's going to work it out. He's going to bring it everything about for good, even though the enemy and the world and things want to use it for evil against us. So let's go ahead and pray. Lord, we do just come before you, and we thank you for your word, Lord, and we thank you just in knowing that when you came to this earth and when you went to the cross, Lord, even in the most hectic and the most, in our eyes, seems like out of control times, you still knew who was in control, who was on the throne, and you didn't worry, you didn't doubt. Lord, we know that you yourself had all the power within you to stop whatever it was that was happening, but yet you chose and you allowed it to happen because you had a purpose and a reason for allowing it to happen. And we know what that reason was, so that you could bring salvation and redemption to mankind. And so, Lord, just help us to also realize that there are times where you allow us to go through things, and the reason might not just be for ourselves. It might be just to be an example to others, or to get us in a place where we can share with someone else, Lord, where we can be an example to people who are around us of what it truly means to have faith and peace and joy, even in times of trial and times of tribulation. So Lord, just teach us just in a greater way to trust in you in these areas, Lord. And I pray for any that might be going through trials right now, that you would give them that peace and that comfort, Lord, in the storm, that they would know that, Lord, you are in control and that you're going to work it out, and that they would just be able to rest in you, Lord, in this time. So we just lift these things up to you and pray them in Jesus' name.